He grew up the earnest son of hard-working immigrants, and his career spans the formative years of American military aviation. He trained most of the American pilots who fought in World War I, and during his few weeks in actual combat, he shot down 2 enemy aircraft. He pioneered air-to-air refueling and commanded the strategic air forces of World War II that forever changed the way wars fought. He so dominated aviation that when Congress spun the Air Force off into an independent service branch, he was the only logical candidate to become its chief of staff. His name is Carl Tooey Spaatz, and he is a deserving legend of Airpower. Carl Spaatz was born in Boyertown, Pennsylvania in 1891. He was one of 5 children, the son of Charles Spaatz, the gregarious publisher of a newspaper printed in both German and English. Spaatz attended the United States Military Academy at West Point. He did it not because he felt drawn to military service, but because it was a way to get a good education without straining his family's finances. The Army of that era was a league of gentlemen where form mattered far more than substance. Spaatz, on the other hand, openly disdained spit and polish. He failed inspections, spent his free time playing poker, and came close to expulsion for drinking beer in an off-limits bar. When asked, he admitted the infraction, risking reprimand but upholding the Academy's honor code. Still, tired of the constrictions of military life, he considered leaving the Academy to seek his destiny elsewhere.
He was standing on the Hudson, and standing on the banks there at West Point, the banks, and he saw this plane come down, and he knew he had to fly. And he stuck West Point for that reason.
He graduated ranked in discipline an abysmal 97th in a class of 107, taking with him little but a reputation for trouble and a nickname, Tooey. The class leaders got their choice of assignments. Spaatz, who wanted only to fly, was assigned to punitive duty as the white officer in the all-black 25th Infantry Regiment. Stationed in Hawaii, he fell in love with Ruth Harrison, the 17-year-old daughter of a colonel in the cavalry.
My grandparents were not awfully pleased because my father was considered a rather wild young man. He did play poker and he did drink a bit.
In 1915, Spaatz transferred to the Signal Corps Aviation Section. He left his new love, Ruth, in Hawaii and reported to North Field in San Diego. His flight training was almost comically brief. He learned more about engine maintenance than about flight itself because more was known about mechanics and aeronautics. After only 5 hours of training, he took off on his first solo. He didn't get far before the engine on the plane quit and he crash-landed. Assigned to the 1st Aero Squadron, Spaatz accompanied Blackjack Pershing on the 1916 punitive expedition into Mexico. A year later, the United States entered World War I. One of only 65 flying officers, the Army swallowed its trepidation and promoted Spaatz to major. It was his last promotion for 17 years.
My mother told me the story that she would stand at Kelly Field and watch him do his acrobatics. Early on in the air service, the pilots were not allowed to do acrobatics of any sort. It was considered too dangerous. And watching Daddy up there doing his acrobatics, and is thinking, oh, isn't he wonderful? This is before they were married. And hearing some old colonel in back saying, there's that young Spaatz up there. Look at him. He is not long for this world.
In July 1917, Spaatz and Ruth married. In September, he left for France. The American command put Spaatz in charge of flight training at Issoudun, a base that was little more than a mud field and a few dilapidated buildings. When he arrived, Spaatz found a small and dispirited corps of American volunteers.
All these young guys who come to be flyers, you know, the most glamorous thing you can be, are all standing around having to do crummy work, you know, piling boulders to, you know, to stop the mud. I mean, they're not training to be flyers. They're unhappy. Their officers are unhappy. Everybody is. And he gets there, he has to straighten the place out. By the time he leaves a year later, it's probably the biggest training field in the world.
While his commanders fumed over his rough edges, his contemporaries came to think of him as an officer who could take a dirty job and get it done. Ordered back to the States, he asked his commanding officer, Billy Mitchell, if he could take a turn in combat. Mitchell gave him 2 weeks. Spaatz stayed 4. He tucked his major's insignia in his pocket and became just another second lieutenant. On his second mission, he shot down 2 German planes, but ran out of fuel over no man's land. An Army patrol saved his life. The New York Times ran a story on the incident without mentioning the pilot's name. When Ruth saw the article, she put down the paper and said, "That has to be Tooey." President Woodrow Wilson believed that national security was a matter of international law, not military power. When the war ended, the armed services withered. The Flyers, however, had come to believe that the Air Forces needed to become a separate service, independent and equal to the Army and Navy. The top brass, of course, disagreed. Billy Mitchell, the most vocal of the Flyers, accused the brass of sabotaging the emerging Air Force. Defending itself before Congress, the Army declared that it had hundreds of aircraft combat ready and charged Mitchell with insubordination. The message was clear. Disagree with the Army's official position, and your career will be over. Mitchell made his trial a test of the Army's readiness and called Spaatz as a witness. In front of the highest-ranking court-martial ever convened, Spaatz testified that the entire United States Army had 59 modern planes, only 15 of which were fighters. Mitchell's attorney asked if the War Department was purposely slowing the development of air power. Spaatz answered with the same forthrightness he had used at West Point to admit he had been drinking in an off-limits bar. "Yes," he said. There were those in the crowd who believed that Tooey Spaatz's career was as good as over. After the Mitchell trial, the Air Corps found itself in a period of neglect that ironically did much to preserve Spaatz's career. He was a bug not worth crushing. In 1935, Spaatz got his first promotion in 17 years to lieutenant colonel. The Army almost instantly regretted it. Assigned to the Army Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Spaatz complained openly about the curriculum, which made almost no mention of aviation. He graduated with a staff recommendation that he was not worthy of further training and was transferred to Langley Field in Virginia. There, Spaatz got elected president of the Officers Club. His first act was to install slot machines on the premises, something that didn't sit well with the brass, but that saved the club from insolvency. On the assumption that Airpower would play a decisive role in the coming war, he implemented a program of modern pilot training that multiplied by 100 the number of pilots that could be trained in a given period of time. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. England declared war against Germany. Germany responded by bombing London. Spaatz went to England as an observer, and for a year he saw firsthand the devastating effect of air power. While the American public worried that England might fall, Spaatz reported back to his superiors that the British would hold. The Germans, he said, lacked a true strategic air force. The Luftwaffe's bombers could reach only as far as southern England, racking London nightly, but unable to reach the industrial cities to the north. In Washington, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall prepared to fight a modern war. He removed senior officers who resisted the emergence of air power and gave the Air Corps its first measure of autonomy, a separate chain of command within the Army. Well-versed in Spaatz's can-do capabilities, Marshall promoted him to general and made him the Army Air Force's first Chief of Staff. Confident that his new position would add stability to his nomadic life, on December 2nd, 1941, Spaatz and his family moved into their first permanent home, a tiny fixer-upper in Alexandria, Virginia. 5 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, word arrived that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor.
He left, and we didn't see him again. He had a cot in his office at that time, and he never came home. He came home for Christmas Eve. It was a big thing that he was coming home.
Not for long. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, General Hap Arnold gave Spaatz command of the newly formed 8th Air Force. The Flyers went to war convinced that strategic air power would end the war without the necessity of a messy ground campaign. The RAF flew under cover of darkness, which protected its aircraft but also hid the targets on the ground. As a result, the British used what they called area bombing, the carpet bombing of whole cities. Spaatz and the Americans considered area bombing barbaric, preferring instead daylight raids on more precise strategic targets. To do that, American planes had to fly by day protected by fighter escorts. The British wanted the American bombers to go out at night, freeing the American fighters for air defense duty along with the RAF.
And Spaatz says, no, I don't want to be integrated into the RAF. No, these fighters are to protect the bombers, and, and that's their mission, and that's how we're going to do it. But he does all this in a way he doesn't make enemies. One of Spaatz's gifts was his ability, to get along with people.
The fighters stayed with the bombers, and the 8th began the pounding of the German military and industrial base that Spaatz believed would bring the war to an end. However, Spaatz was not long for England. Americans had invaded North Africa, and they needed help. Eisenhower dispatched Spaatz to North Africa to try to build the level of cooperation between the Americans and the British. Spaatz acquired a slate-topped poker table and used his quiet social skills to smooth the ruffled egos around him. For the first time, the British and Americans came together to conduct the devastating air-ground campaign that drove the Nazis off the African continent. It was, without question, the greatest victory air power had ever won. In January 1944, with the invasion of Normandy looming, Eisenhower promoted Spaatz to the command of all strategic air forces in Europe. Key to the success of the invasion was the destruction of the Luftwaffe. Eisenhower devoted 50% of the Allied strategic might to the destruction of the factories that built planes for the Germans. What to do with the other half of the bombers was something no one seemed able to agree on. Two basic strategies emerged. The transportation plan would target railroads and bridges, making it difficult or impossible for the Nazis to move men and materiel. The second strategy was the oil plan, in which Allied bombers would target the infrastructure that refined and delivered critical fuel. The 15th Air Force, operating out of Italy, had already devastated the Romanian fields that provided 50% of Germany's oil. Spaatz advocated going after the synthetic oil factories in Germany that made up the shortfall.
It's the perfect strategic target. You have 16 small plants, 16 discrete targets that if you can bomb those out, you basically crash oil production. You bring them down to such a production they can't, tanks won't roll, planes won't fly. And it looks feasible.
Eisenhower chose the transportation plan. Hampered by bad weather and perhaps an Air Force command that disagreed with its mission, the attacks on German transportation were slow and ineffective. The Nazis stopped sending their fighters up to resist the bombers, which proved to Spaatz that the transportation bombing wasn't hurting them. In April 1944, the Germans launched the first V-1 buzz bomb at London. The British insisted that all bombers, American and British, be used to attack the launch sites. Outraged, Spaatz demanded an audience with Eisenhower. The two met in private.
There are some rumors that Tooey actually threatened to resign, that if he couldn't get his way, he would resign. And Eisenhower doesn't want the bad press from that. He likes Tooey for one thing, but you don't want to have a public split right before the invasion, especially if things go wrong. So that's a fairly potent threat, though not, but maybe not the ultimate one.
When they emerged, Spaatz had permission to spend 2 days bombing the synthetic oil plants. What Ike got in return was a head of strategic air forces who didn't drag his feet on the transportation plan. The day after the agreement with Eisenhower, the 8th struck the largest rail yards in Europe, in Bonn, a target that before the meeting had always somehow been sucked in by bad weather. In May, Spaatz sent the 8th after the synthetic oil plants. The Luftwaffe, almost invisible for 2 months of transportation plant bombing, came up in swarms. Intelligence reports confirmed what Spaatz had suspected. The Germans wouldn't hold the Luftwaffe in reserve if it meant losing oil production. Spaatz's 2 days of oil plant bombing knocked out more than 60% of Germany's synthetic oil production.
The chart on that is just straight down. It's a perfect strategic campaign. So, and everyone can see these ultra-intercepts. They get passed all around the headquarters, and everyone says, yep, you're right, Spaatz.
Armed with new P-51 Mustangs, the Army Air Force knocked German fighters out of the sky as fast as the Luftwaffe could get them launched. In what had become a war of attrition, the Nazis couldn't train pilots as fast as Spaatz could shoot them down. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had failed to modernize his training methods. Unlike Spaatz, Göring loved the formality of military life and emphasized it even when it interfered with battlefield operations.
Like in 1942, they only trained 600 more pilots than they lost. They were still having skiing lessons and ballroom dancing lessons in their fighter instruction courses in 1942. I mean, they weren't really focused on the problem. So what this caught up with them, by 1943 and early 44, the Luftwaffe is desperately short of fighter pilots.
On June 6, the Allies invaded Normandy. The Luftwaffe's resistance was negligible. The Germans, like the Italians before them, were reeling. Their industrial base lay in ruins, and the Allies had a free hand in the skies. On the ground, the Allies moved forward almost at a sprint. In December 1944, the Germans mounted one last desperate counterattack. After the Battle of the Bulge, Spaatz believed the time had come for the same sort of display of force that had inspired the Italians to surrender. He ordered devastating attacks on central Berlin. Looking for leverage, he sent bombers to Dresden, a largely unarmed city that had never been bombed. The bombing created a firestorm that incinerated tens of thousands of civilians. On the 20th of February, he ordered the 8th to Nuremberg. On the 22nd, he executed Operation Clarion, a combined effort of the 8th and 15th Air Forces that targeted small rail yards in town centers, destroying scores of towns around Germany.
People are saying, wait a minute, you know, the Air Force does not go out and kill people. Why are we running these raids to kill all these Germans, you know? And then when Dresden happened a week before, said, what is the plan here? And Spaatz replies, no, the point of this is not to kill Germans. The point of this is to show Germans how helpless they are.
What had worked in Italy failed in Germany. The Nazis didn't surrender until Russian tanks entered Berlin, and the American and British had captured both the industrial and agricultural heartlands of Germany. Spaatz attended the surrender ceremony amid the rubble that had been Germany. He was, like the rest of the Allied officers, both tired and exhilarated. One war had been won. Another remained. With the war in Europe ended, Hap Arnold ordered the 8th Air Force to Okinawa. He put Spaatz in command, and for good measure, gave him control of the 20th Air Force stationed in Guam. The goal, Arnold made clear, was to make sure that the Air Force played a key role in the victory. Spaatz stopped on his way to the Pacific for a short rest with his family in Miami. While there, bouncing his granddaughter on his knee, an orderly brought him a message.
I'll never forget it. He picked Teddy up, put her on the floor. Teddy started crying. Not like Daddy. He put her on the floor, left the room, came back later dressed in uniform, and left. And he didn't come back for 2 days. And he came back just enough to pick up Mother and go back. That was the time, it had to have been the time, that he went up to Washington and was told by General Handy about the atomic bomb.
It was Spaatz's job as the new head of strategic bombing in the Pacific to drop the bomb on Japan. Spaatz, having seen the devastation of Germany and suspecting what history would have to say about the use of this new bomb, insisted the order be put in writing. Arnold had the orders typed out before Spaatz left. On his way to Okinawa, Spaatz stopped in the Philippines. After viewing Douglas MacArthur's plans for the invasion of Japan, Spaatz told MacArthur about the bomb. the invasion they both knew would never happen. Spaatz said years later that the dropping of the atomic bomb was done by a military man under military orders. Japan surrendered on August 14th. For better or for worse, the war and the arrival of nuclear weapons proved once and for all the horrifying primacy of air power. By attending the surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri, Spaatz became the only officer to attend the surrender of all three Axis powers, the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese.
I think if there's any hallmark of Tooey Spaatz, is that he got the job done. You give him something, you give him a crummy, rotten job, and he'll do it, and he'll do it probably better and quicker than anyone else.
With much of the world in ruins, Spaatz returned to Washington. Congress liberated the United States Air Force from Army command in September 1947. Tooey Spaatz became its first chief of staff. He arranged the Air Force to reflect his personality, a service built on merit, not social pretension, with change of command based on critical functions, not politics. It was, he believed, the Air Force the country needed, the Air Force he and his fellow officers had talked about their whole lives.
He just quietly, on July 1st, after he had been in a year, he quietly closed his door. There was no retirement ceremony, nothing of that sort. He just quietly closed his door and went fishing.
Spaatz was not finished, however. In 1952, his friend, President Eisenhower, asked him to chair the committee that would choose the location of the new Air Force Academy. After sifting through more than 350 sites in 22 states, Spaatz and the committee recommended to the Secretary of the Air Force 3 sites. The Secretary chose a 17,000-acre site north of Colorado Springs. Tooey Spaatz died in 1974 at the age of 83. The flyer who had little use for military education, who had come close to being expelled from West Point, and who was openly critical of the Command and General Officer School at Fort Leavenworth, was buried on the grounds of the new Air Force Academy.